This guy is a moderately religious guy is in Jerusalem, has a court appointment, and he's got to get to the courthouse, and he left a little bit late. He's rushing around, and he's searching. He drove there. He's trying to find a parking space. There's no parking space. Anyway, he's driving around, circling around, looking for a parking space. He's desperate. I can't find a parking space. He finally says, "God, please, I need a parking space. I've got to get to this thing, or I'm in big trouble with the court. Please, I need a parking space. I will observe all the mitzvot. I will promise you. I will do everything on Rosh Hashanah, every Shabbat. I will promise to keep it." And just then, a car right in front of the courthouse pulls out right in front of him, and he looks up and he goes, "Never mind, I got a space here."
Welcome to the Comical Heathen. This is your host, Dr. Marc Jaffe. I started today's episode with a cold opening. The voice you heard at the beginning was comedian Marc Jaffe telling me one of his favorite jokes. I had a chance to interview him recently. If you don't know Marc Jaffe, he's a comedian and comedy writer based in the Cleveland area. He is most famous for being a writer on the Seinfeld show, and we are going to discuss that during the interview. Both how he got that job and what it was like working for Seinfeld, as well as what some of the content parameters might have been. He's also written some plays and books. His most well-known book is called I'm Sleeping with Your Gynecologist. Mark's wife is, in fact, a gynecologist, and he tells anecdotes and humorous stories from the life of being married to a doctor. So you should check that out. Let me get one thing out of the way. Both Mark and my last name is spelled Jaffe. His name is pronounced Jaffe, whereas I pronounce my name Jaffe. Sorry for the background, but I thought that should be clarified. People often ask if we are related. We are not particularly related. Jaffe is a common Jewish name. We usually say that Jaffe, as Mark pronounces it, is the Americanized pronunciation, and Jaffe, as my family pronounces it, is a little bit more the ethnic pronunciation. After my interview with Mark, there will be an update from the Rabbit Hutch, as well as my reaction to an article I found called Don't Dismiss the Power of Prayer. So make sure you hang around for that. And, this podcast is available on iTunes, Stitcher, Podbean. So make sure when you listen to it, you give us stars, give us likes, give us comments. All those sorts of actions help us grow the podcast. Anyway, I want to welcome you. Thank you for listening today. And next, my interview with Marc Jaffe.
And the podcast is called The Comical Heathen.
The Comical Heathen?
Yes.
Okay. Which I think, I don't know, I would say probably a high percentage of comedians are.
Yes.
I think it's very rare that to have somebody like Colbert, who's an avowed Catholic, who
Sure.
Still adheres to the faith.
Sure.
Just in my general talks with comedians, I don't think.
I think there's a high degree of cynicism amongst comedians sometimes.
Right.
I'd say I've got about 10 episodes out now, and so go back and listen to them. But about half of the people I've interviewed, because we don't have to talk about religion,
right?
But people like to talk about that, and I'd say about half the people I've interviewed have said they believe in something.
And the other half don't believe in anything?
Pretty much.
Okay.
It's either nihilists or believers. Like there's
well,
not much more.
Let's see, where would I fall into those? As I get older and older, I start to fall into the not believing in anything category.
Sure.
But certainly when I was young, I had a strong upbringing in religion. I went to Hebrew day school.
Sure. So did you learn Hebrew at Hebrew day school?
Well, I did. I now speak Hebrew, but it wasn't from. I had a good basis in terms of like reading and writing, but there wasn't any spoken. But we did read it and write it in school, so I got that. But the religious stuff was more the focus than cultural or things to do with Israel. And we used to have these rabbis that were guys would hit us and make our fingers. Pull our fingers back and do all kinds of things, nasty things. And actually, I used to joke in my act. I'd say that we had a religious exchange program with a Catholic school near us, where once a month the nuns would come over and hit us. So we got to learn about both religions.
Sure. Multiculturalism.
Right.
Always
right.
good.
So yeah, through 6th grade, I was in a serious crap where you have to, now I look back on it. And it was funny because my mother absolutely couldn't stand this.
Mm-hmm.
And my father was the one who insisted we go there because he had, my grandfather was, funded the school to some degree, and or he gave the money and was Orthodox, and my father grew up Orthodox and my mother grew up Reformed, so there was always that battle going on in my house.
All right.
Of
sure.
What you can do and what you can't. So we kept kosher, but we would occasionally. My mother loved lobster. She would bring in the lobster on paper plates. You couldn't infect the dishes. But, you could eat it on paper plates, which I always was also something I wondered about, because clearly we could never eat pork. Mm-hmm. But, there was always the exception to eating lobster, which I think it was because Jews were never persecuted by being forced to eat lobster.
Sure.
It's like, you filthy Jew, dip it in the butter sauce, it was so. But, yeah, there was all kinds of weird conflicts going on in my religious upbringing.
So when did you start doing stand-up, like approximately?
Half an hour ago.
Okay. How's that going for you so far?
Pretty good. I think.
Made any money in the past 29 and a half minutes?
No. So I think that portends well for the rest of my career. I started doing it I did a little in high school.
Sure.
There wasn't much opportunity around, but then when I went to college, I did every other week. There was a show, more of a sketch show.
Right. And
then in grad school, there was a club that started that was just a stand-up club at the university, and I started doing that.
And was that in Chicago? Grad school?
No, well, that was the University of Michigan.
Okay, Ann Arbor?
Yep. And then in the summer, between my 2 years of grad school, I went to Chicago for a job and would hit the clubs at night, and that's when I said, oh, wow, this is so... I was doing well in a big city, not just college.
Approximately 1980-ish or earlier?
Early 80s. So that would have been 80. Summer of 81 was when I was in Chicago.
Okay.
Baseball strike season.
Was there much comedy?
Yeah. Chicago was there was Zanies, which still exists, and then there was a couple of other clubs that are no longer in existence, but kind of more suburban clubs, and but they were showcase clubs, which was nice. So instead of like now. Most cities, aside from New York, L.A., and Chicago, I guess to some degree, have the middle opener, middle headliner, or MC middle headliner kind of thing, where they bring in someone in. This was, everybody does 15, 20 minutes, whatever, and there's maybe a dozen comedians in the course of a night. It would go late into the night, and so you would fight for slots. There were a lot of comedians around, and I just went. Initially nobody knew me. It was my first time in Chicago, and somebody would give me a late night slot, and then slowly by the end of the summer, they were giving me the Saturday night, good slots. So I was like, okay, well, I'm successful here to a degree. Maybe I should, instead of following up and getting after I got my MBA, rather than getting a real job.
So a business degree.
Yeah, business degree. I should just chuck all that and move out to LA.
So with your MBA, you never thought of owning a comedy club?
Yeah. On occasion, I did think of it. I looked around in Chicago, actually, at one point. That's too much work.
In those early 80s in Chicago and then later in New York, just around, were a lot of comedians doing either religion or religious satire. Was that rare? Was it common? Was it particular people did it?
Wow. I don't recall it being particularly prevalent, but I think there were certainly, I kind of remember Carlin doing things like that, but he wasn't he was at a different level than what I was talking about or interacting with on a day-to-day basis.
How about you? Were you at that time, was that a thing in your act at all, writing jokes about it?
Only to the degree that it was personal, and I think that's what most people would do it as, rather than I don't think there were too many out there saying, okay, I'm going to tackle the subject of Catholicism or something like that, or some, let's talk about the Pope. I think they were, doing it like I was on a personal level. If there was something about my being Jewish or my upbringing that I thought was funny, I would be willing to try it. And it never, at most I would have little bits where, maybe 2 minutes or 3 minutes on something that,
Sure.
Rather than just one line, but nothing more than that.
Right, and it was generally cultural, like being raised Jewish or being Jewish. Or...
Yeah. Well, you have to realize that your audience isn't necessarily going to understand if you're getting too into the weeds.
Yes, I have a great bris joke that rarely gets a good laugh.
Right. But do you have a great brisket? That's the question.
I deserve that.
If there were occasions where I get hired for a function, a Jewish function or something, where I could stretch out, so to speak,
Okay, sure.
and say, okay, this is a little more. They'll understand this stuff. If I throw in the word charoset, they'll know what it is.
You're joining us somewhat mid-conversation. We haven't actually been properly introduced. I'm your host, Dr. Jerry Jaffe, and I'm pleased to have as a guest and conversation partner Marc Jaffe.
Yeah, we have the same spelling, different pronunciation. I don't know how that happened, but
I'm under the impression that the Jaffe pronunciation is the Americanized pronunciation, and that the Jaffe is the ethnic pronunciation.
Okay.
And this conversation.
Where do you think the name came from? Do you have any idea where you're?
My great-grandfather came from Latvia, so it has a kind of Latvian/Russian origin, though the urban legend is that it may go back further to in Israel.
But that was his name, even back in the old country.
Yes, was Jaffe.
Really?
Yeah.
Because mine wasn't. Mine was, I think, Berkovitz.
Okay.
Was the name? Same area.
Sure.
That my grandfather came from,
but
then he changed it when he came to America, and I don't know. I think it was just based on the city in Israel, or
Yes.
So
it's like the Orange City.
Right.
City of oranges.
Right.
And orange flavored candies. My grandfather had one brother, both now passed away, but they pronounced their names differently. So my
really?
grandfather's, meaning me as well, all say Jaffe, but his brother, so all my cousins on that side of the family all say Jaffe.
Oh, okay. That's
It's a
interesting.
little weird. I'm sure you know Marc Jaffe, but if you don't know Marc Jaffe, one of your big credits is being a writer for Seinfeld. Mm-hmm. How long did you do that for?
Well, I was on staff for the first full season of Seinfeld, and then I contributed some episodes after that, freelance stories through just pitching to them and my relationship with them.
There's 3 or 4 episodes you have writing credits for, like your name is on screen, but you were also part of the writing staff, contributing.
Well, yeah, the season when I was on staff, I have screen credit, but it comes afterwards, so I don't have story or script credit. Then the ones that I sold as the story, then those I have the pre-show credits.
On the one hand, that's network television, and even 20 years ago, 25 years ago. So it's, in a way, not edgy by what people today would think of as edgy. But in that time period, you have Jerry Seinfeld, whose stand-up is so welcoming. But the show, which could be edgy.
Right. Yeah, it was somewhat innovative at the time, and certainly touched on subjects and to things that were on the edge. Yeah.
Sure. Of course, master your domain is like the famous phrase, but
well, mine that was a little, I don't know if it's edgy or not, but is the nipple where Elaine exposes her nipple on a Christmas card.
Yes.
Here we are with all these Christmas trees around.
Yes, in the lovely Allen Theater,
yes,
Playhouse
at
Square.
The time. But so I guess that was probably a little bit edgy.
And over the course of the show, there's an episode here and there where religion might come up. I remember an episode where Elaine dated someone who was religious, and then it turned into an episode about abortion and choice. But in general, most of your television sitcoms aren't going to tackle religious issues as like.
You don't want to alienate half your audience. So, it's a much harder thing to do in depth, or I don't think it's necessarily the place for it in a sitcom. There are other places in television, certainly nowadays, where it would be something you could do.
Well, I mean, nowadays between cable and all your other platforms, there's certainly like variety of outlets for the variety of
Right.
voices and point of views and what have you.
Yeah.
A thing which I've observed, but I'm wondering if it's true. So just let me know if you have an opinion. I feel like this has a serious side to it, so I'm trying to prepare you for this question more
that's right.
friendly. Since September 11th, I feel like there's been more religious satire floating around the comedic world.
Well, I don't know necessarily that picking September 11th as a point of inflection is something that, well, maybe it would be, and certainly in terms of the Islamic world and
Sure.
having that all of a sudden be something that people maybe
Sure.
open their eyes to and have different opinions on in terms of whether it's how we treat people, Muslims, and how we keep ourselves safe, I guess, or
Sure.
whatever. So yeah, in that that would have become a subject that would be allowed to be talked about, or be necessary to
Okay.
be talked about after
Sure.
September 11th more than it was before, I guess. As someone who
Right.
had lived in Israel and
Okay.
traveled in the Arab world and speaks Hebrew and some Arabic as well, it was something that had always been on my mind,
Okay.
trying to get a handle on the whole, on that situation.
Sure.
So,
Complexities. And
yeah.
All that goes
So for me, it wasn't like something all of a sudden that I said, oh, September 11th now, things have changed.
Sure. Now I need to think about these things.
Right,
You were already
right.
thinking about them.
Right. So for me, I wouldn't say in any way it was a point of inflection, but for society, American society, sure it was in so many ways. So to think that it would be extrapolated into comedy as well is not beyond reason.
Now you mentioned George Carlin. Were there any other comedians when you started doing comedy who may have influenced you? Or that
Who
you-
influenced me, not necessarily with religion.
No, yeah.
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 I think I was influenced by all of them to some degree.
Sure.
I mean, there are people that I loved as a kid. I was loved Woody Allen. I loved
Sure.
Bill Cosby.
Sure.
Any other sexual predators that I should
That you've left out?
Flip Wilson I used to like, and then as I got older, it's hard to remember exactly who I loved then versus
Sure.
who I love now. And at some point I got into Bob and Ray, and those guys
Okay.
are just brilliant. I love them. Steve Martin, when he came along, was just eye-opening. He was
Sure.
so unique and just phenomenal, deconstructing things. And
Yeah, he seemed to be like the first
yeah,
postmodern comedian. Like
Yeah.
everything was meta, but also he was just enormously successful. Like doing
Yeah.
the idea you could do comedy in stadiums or
yeah.
that
Yeah.
kind of.
So those guys have all been influences. And then as some of my peers, people that I love now, still now, there's plenty of great people out there. So.
Sure. Mark kindly, when I asked him to do this interview, jotted down some of your old jokes.
Oh, well, actually, not all more old. I'm just
okay.
trying to remember because there was religious stuff. I mentioned a couple. The religious exchange program. Let's see, it was the lobster thing. I used to joke about Hanukkah, which is coming up.
Okay, what's a good Hanukkah?
Hanukkah, I would say, comparing it to Christmas, people don't know Hanukkah has 8 days, and we give a present every day.
Yes.
Like as a kid, I remember the first day my sister used to get a doll's head, and by the 8th day, she pretty much knew what she was getting. that was my Hanukkah joke. Let's see. People ask why there's so many Jews or comedians, and I always said that I thought it was kind of a metaphor for our position in society. Standing alone and getting by on our wits, And also, there's no physical labor involved.
Yes.
So that's really the main thing.
Yeah.
So those are a few. I have some that are still in my act and talk about things, getting to heaven and so forth. But they'll have to come see me
Yeah, absolutely.
to hear the current stuff.
Sure. Well, we're talking now at the 10th annual Cleveland Comedy Festival.
Yes.
We just was part of a very interesting panel about television writing. For people who want to see Marc Jaffe do stand-up, how can they find out about those appearances?
Well, I'm appearing tonight, so how quickly are you able to turn this thing
So
around?
he's appearing 2 months ago at the...
Okay. And beyond 2 months from now, I have no idea where I'm going to be performing. I don't do it very often now. I'm semi-retired, and it's hard to... I'll appear at Toth's comedy on a Wednesday night at some point.
In the future near you.
Yeah, yeah.
Just a couple more generic questions on the topic of religious satire. As a writer and performer who's done so much, and then as I would say, younger comedians, around you bothering you, would you have any advice?
Don't bother me.
Or any advice for someone about religious satire? Like, is there a way to do it well? Is there things that you wouldn't recommend? Or
No, I mean, in terms of stand-up, it's just it's still depending on the joke. I mean, is it funny? If it's funny, it has to be funny first. Now, then beyond that, you may have to edit yourself depending on how how you want your audience to react. So they can some might be offended by things. I struggle with this a little bit. Like I here's a joke that I have currently in my act. I talk about how I have certain genetic issues. I don't know what's going to get me in the end. I don't know what I'm going to die from. Talk about death a lot. It's a very good subject for comedy.
Hilarious. Agreed.
So I don't know what's going to get me in the end. Being Jewish, I have certain genetic issues. For example, if I die from what got my grandparents, I'm most likely to die from Nazis, which gets both a laugh and a oh.
Yes.
So it's like, well, is it worth the laugh for that other reaction? And are they really upset? Am I hitting people who have lost somebody in the Holocaust? Is that But being Jewish, am I allowed to say that? Am I? You may run into something where you get that kind of reaction, and you have to decide: is it worth keeping in my act, or am I offending anybody? Do I care if I offend anybody? So it's.
We're both Jewish. You've been talking about it. You alluded a moment ago about Jewish comedians. Do you think there's a Jewish sense of humor? Is there something about Jewish personality or culture or religion that fosters humor?
Well, the thing that I said earlier, making a joke about me not being physical labor, but the first part of that I think is definitely valid. I think there's definitely something to the idea that it is kind of a metaphor for our position in society and being isolated and getting by on our wits. And I think there's also an acceptance of I think there's a tradition in our religion that's non-doctrinaire and always evolving.
Sure.
And so because of that, it allows us to question and to make fun of something. And so, you don't have to listen to a pope or anything like that. You can make your own decisions on things. So I think that allows for a freedom to question things and questioning and looking at society in an honest and truthful manner, or your religion or whatever it is you're going to find humor. So.
Oh, Marc Jaffe, let me just ask you one more question. I sometimes just end on this as an interviewer.
You want me to do a dance?
Yes. Could you, for radio too? I'll describe it to the listeners while you're doing it. No, just on the topic of religious satire, is there anything we haven't covered that just you have an opinion or anything you'd like to say about religious satire?
I'm always happy to have more of it. I think it's a good thing to do. I think religion is one of both the easiest and the hardest things to satirize.
Sure.
I think people who can do it well, it's a great thing, and hopefully will open the eyes of some people who are a little fundamentalism in anything is always going to be a little bit scary, but in religion seems to be more so than other things. So making fun of that kind of stuff, I think it's always good to do.
Well, it seems like a somber and wise place to stop. So
Okay.
let me just end by thanking you, Mark, for
All right,
sitting
you're
out with me
welcome.
for a few minutes.
It's been my pleasure.
Thank
It's
you.
to do this here on the Sabbath.
Yes. I'm operating a machine that I do not think is approved in any way.
Right. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Mark.
All right, Jerry.
So that's my interview with Marc Jaffe. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Really enjoyed hearing about the early days on Seinfeld and how he got on the show and some of his other interests. So I hope you got as much out of that as I did. As you may know, my wife and I are rabbit enthusiasts. We have 2 Holland Lops right now, Newton and little baby Calvin. They're getting along very well. One of the things that rabbits do in the wild is that they're very territorial. And when you bring 2 new rabbits together, they do different things to get used to each other. Something that some rabbits will do in the wild and household pet rabbits is what's called chinning. Chinning is when a rabbit goes up to an object that's part of its territory and rubs its chin on it, sort of spreading its scent so that other animals know that this area is its territory. And it seems really cute when house rabbits do it because, of course, Calvin and Newton live indoors, so there's not like other animals or predators or animals around. Calvin is really into chinning. He goes all over the cages, all over the toys, all over the furniture that he can reach, and you put anything in his area, and he runs straight up to it and starts chinning it. And I just want to tell you one really cute story. My daughter had a stuffed toy octopus, and she wanted to see what the rabbits would do, so she put it down in their carpet where they spend most of their time, and Calvin ran right up to it and systematically and carefully chinned all 8 tentacles one at a time. Like rub, rub, rub. It was very funny watching him do it so systematically. So that's what's going on with Calvin and Newton today. You know, one of the side effects of having rabbits in the house is that we have rabbit cages, and we line the rabbit cages with newspaper. It seems like, the last practical use for newspaper in this modern digital age. But because of having all these newspapers around, I've actually started reading headlines again. At the bottom of rabbit cages, but still I'm reading the headlines again. And every once in a while, a headline will pop out having to do with some topic related to religion. And what will stand out is that there's something either misleading or controversial or incorrect about it. Sometimes even just factually incorrect. And whenever I see a headline like that or an article like that, I just have to correct it. Because in my opinion, misinformation is a sin. So that's why I say misinformation. I'm not trying to ruin anybody's good time. I'm just spreading the love. It might be your dogma, but it's my karma. So what did I find at the bottom of the rabbit hutch today? I came across a headline from the Jewish Journal, published in November 2017. Of course, it's natural that the Jewish Journal would have articles on religion, as well as recipes for cinnamon spice gefilte fish. Of course, that's natural. But this particular headline really caught my attention. The headline said, "Don't dismiss the power of prayer." It's made me curious, who's dismissing what power? As it turns out, the article was written in response to a recent mass shooting. Unfortunately, saying written in response to a recent mass shooting doesn't actually give you enough information to know what I'm talking about, which is itself a sad commentary on the state of things in America when I can use the phrase recent mass shooting and you don't know which one I'm referring to. Because this is America today. I've got to clarify which recent mass shooting we're even talking about. Well, in this case, the gun over enthusiast walked into a Baptist church and killed 26 people, leaving another 20 injured. In response, politicians snapped into crisis response mode, rolling up their sleeves to do the hard work of offering thoughts and prayers. For example, Speaker of the House Paul Ryan tweeted, "The people of Sutherland Springs need our prayers right now." So, the third highest ranking U.S. official, second only to the president and vice president, called for immediate action from God. Now, some noted that there was irony in politicians passing the buck to the man upstairs when the slaughter du jour happens to take place in a church full of parishioners that was converted into a scene from the beginning of Saving Private Ryan. Now, the article in the Jewish Journal does not acknowledge this irony. Instead, it cites examples like actor Will Wheaton, who tweeted in response to Ryan, "The murder victims were in a church. If prayers did anything, they'd still be alive." And well-known iconoclast Keith Olbermann, also in response to Ryan, blasted, "Shove your prayers up your ass and do something with your life besides platitudes and power grabs." So the article disregards the context of ineffectual politicians dishing out platitudes like a cafeteria worker plops food onto tray after tray, and tries to reframe it under the straw man argument of religious persecution. It only takes notice of this semi-automatic elephant gun in the room long enough to dismiss it. Starting off with the phrase, quote, "It is questionable whether some additional law would have prevented the massacre," end quote. As I was reading it, it might as well have continued with something like, "'Cause, laws are like unpredictable and stuff." Hey, I agree. It is questionable whether some additional laws would have prevented the massacre. That would be a wonderful question to explore. Sadly, it's a question that gun makers and gun sellers and gun lovers won't let anyone explore. Oh no, now's not the time for a discussion of common sense gun restrictions, ever. When 71 people died, in the Grenfell Tower fire in West London, that suddenly became a really good time to talk about the flammability of construction materials. But when a church full of worshipers is mowed down, well, then it's always too soon, too political. So I know I'm not supposed to, it being too soon and all, but I'll go ahead and ask anyway. Would hypothetical law X, Y, or Z have made some kind of difference in this particular case? Yeah, maybe. There are plenty of simple, common sense, and constitutional laws and measures that could help alleviate the gun violence epidemic in this country. Things like closing gun show loopholes, things like more extensive background checks, things like limitations on pseudo-automatic weapons. There's new technologies like smart guns that recognize fingerprints. It's entirely within reason to believe that ideas like this could have prevented or lessened the carnage in this event or events like it. But our article relegates these glaring possibilities to the, quote, "just no way of knowing for sure, so best not to discuss them" closet before moving on to the main thrust, crying victim. The article warns, quote, "there's something deeper going on with these anti-prayer tweets, more troubling." It goes on to say, "dismissing prayer dismisses the value of religion in general," quote unquote. Holy straw man, Batman. It's a straw holy man. These tweets didn't dismiss religion in general any more than people's distaste for Hitler dismissed a short stash. The message wasn't, "Hey believers, stop believing." The message was, "Hey politicians, knock off the scoring of easy points with comments about prayer and actually do your job with your position of power that might be difficult, but will strike at the real issue, the gun violence epidemic." The article next goes on to claim, quote, "conflating prayer-driven action with action you like makes religion irrelevant and your political agenda paramount." Quote, "Yes, shame on you tweeters for making your pleas to politicians all political and stuff. And not just political, but about your political beliefs. Instead of my political beliefs, it uses the phrase prayer-driven action. What the fuck does that even mean? Prayer-driven action? If it means prayer, just say prayer. But if it means prayer-driven action, I thought prayer was for things that human actions can't do, things that require divine intervention to get done, like parting the Red Sea, or watching TV for 24 straight hours without encountering a Kardashian. What the hell does prayer-driven action mean? It says we shouldn't mix together with actions we like because that would be placing our political priorities over religion? So, I mean, I guess that means we should pray for things we don't like or something like that. I'm starting to pray that this article would make more sense. To give it the benefit of the doubt, I guess what it's getting at is that we shouldn't just pray for things for our own benefit or our own interests. I mean, if so, then what about football players on opposing teams who both pray to win the big game? What should they do? Maybe they should pray to different gods. Or the first team to pray gets dibs on God, and then God has to recuse himself from the other team to avoid any chance of conflict of interest. Or maybe there should be like a substitute god to cover the big guy when he rests on the seventh day. You know, like a senior assistant god for the tri-state region, excluding the downtown area and parts of Putnam County. As the article goes on, it then wants to try to explain how prayer, in the face of not getting what you want, helps keep humans humble because, quote, God's plan is not ours, end quote. What? Wait, what? Well, then whose flag is God waving if not ours? Like we humans have been taking up space while the whole time God has actually created heaven and earth for the mollusks? God's plan is not ours, it says. Nevertheless, we should continue filling out customer comment cards and narrating them skyward, so that when management doesn't change its policy, we derive all the benefits of being kept humble and avoid what the article calls, quote, foolish optimism of utopianism. Remember, utopia in this case, meaning a place without mass shootings, mass opioid addictions, and cheese you squeeze out of a tube, i.e. most other countries on Earth. I mean, this whole canard of bowing to God's grand but unknowable plan reminds me of an old joke, if you'll pardon the digression. The Wall Street banker who worked 20 hours a day, full of stress and anxiety, and dropped dead at age 30. Meeting God in heaven, he demands to know why life had to be so hard and stressful. To which God replies, "That's what all the marijuana was for. Christ, I planted it everywhere." Maybe God wants us to smoke marijuana. Maybe God wants us to get rid of these guns and have better background checks and smart guns. How can this article put down basic optimism as selfish and idealistic, but then promote the idea of phoning in your requests to the celestial DJ above, but then play the God's Mysterious Ways card, also known as the Get Out of Thinking Free card? Maybe my foolish optimism for utopia is God's plan. Article goes on to say that prayer might have other values. The article scolds atheists for dismissing prayer as empty verbiage, asking, quote, how many people have been changed because they entered a prayerful community, end quote. So this article is called Don't Dismiss the Power of Prayer, but rather than presenting, evidence for the power of prayer, it switches to talking about the power of community. And it's not even making statements. It's asking for a tally of anecdotes of power of community. And the power of community cuts both ways. It could just as easily have asked, how many people's lives have changed for the better because they left a prayerful community? Shout out to Westboro escapees, Scientology escapees, and ex-Mormons everywhere. It's not that prayer is being mocked. It's these tweets from politicians that are being mocked. It's inaction and the lack of will to effect change and the practical dereliction of duty that are being mocked. But according to this article, we can't tweet about that fact because doing so would be tantamount to mocking the prayerful or something like that apparently. Just to end, I would say this point. Of course, I agree that religion as an institution is important to our country. But to paraphrase the wise Groucho Marx, who wants to live in an institution? So all that remains for me is to thank Marc Jaffe for being my interview guest today. I want to thank my good friend Jeff Geddert for his assistance on production, as well as for writing and editing some of the material you hear on this podcast. And the wonderful Bach organ music you hear comes from my friend Mark Bell. I hope you enjoy it. And finally, make sure you look us up on iTunes and give us stars and give us likes. All that kind of stuff helps the podcast grow. And that just remains for me, your host, Dr. Jerry Jaffe, to thank you for listening to today's episode. Thank you.
haven't been able to give to the Federation for all these years. They're like, what do we? They say, you know what? Let's just go. We'll go over. We'll knock on our door. And they have all the information, and they knock on our door. They say, hey, Shmulik, look, we know you have 2 homes in Europe. You have this, you have that. They says, why don't you give to the? You should be giving to the Federation. He goes, look, I know you see all the houses and the cars. I'll tell you what you don't see. You don't see that I got 2 elderly parents who need full-time care and being taken care of in their home. You don't see I've got a brother who has mental issues, is incapacitated and needs full-time care. You don't see that I have a sister who has drinking or alcohol abuse problems. You don't see all these things, and if I don't give to any of them, you think I'm going to give to you?